We're now happy to take questions.
Senator Cruz,
Yeah.
you talked about congressional review and trying to ensure that that actually happens. What mechanisms do you have at your disposal to ensure that? Is it INARA from 2013? Is it some new legislation? Can you explain to us what that might be?
So under the explicit terms of INARA, any agreement can't go into effect unless it is submitted to Congress for approval. And so the Biden administration needs to comply with that law. My understanding is there's some creative lawyers at the State Department that are trying to find ways around that law. But we're a nation of laws. And the right way to do this would be a treaty. And if it were actually a substantively good deal, you should be able to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree with it. But the reason Biden doesn't want to do it as a treaty is because this is a deal negotiated between Russia and Iran. It's a terrible deal for America. It's a terrible deal for Israel. It's a terrible deal for the world. And so there would be no prayer at getting 2/3 support.
I've got some new legislation, too, I might mention, Tim.
Sure.
I'd like to also mention that 38 of my colleagues here, myself and 37 other colleagues, are all co-sponsors of the Iran Sanctions Review Act of 2021. It takes the same language that was used with the Russian CAATSA Act that was passed with bilateral support back in 2017. Substitutes the word Russia with Iran. Any sanctions relief that's provided to Iran, and this deal will have sanctions relief in it, must come to the Senate, must come to the House for review. That's what we'd like to see done, and we are, again, the majority of Republicans in our conference are sponsoring this act. So there's another avenue that we can take as well to broaden the reach. Again, as Senator Cruz mentioned, this should come as a treaty. If not, INARA should work. Failing that, my legislation will help address it.
One more point on INARA. So again, just for a little bit of history, I know you all know it, but it's worth repeating. Even under INARA with the original JCPOA, a agreement of that magnitude in terms of national security, I think it's the first time in U.S. history that it had a bipartisan majority opposing it. Bipartisan majority in the House, bipartisan majority in the Senate opposed the original JCPOA. So again, this wasn't even supported by the vast majority of Republicans or Democrats the first time around. And they better bring it to the Congress because, as Ted said, that's the rule of law. I agree it should be viewed as a treaty. But remember, the original JCPOA had a bipartisan majority in both houses that were actually opposed to it.
Well, and just to follow up on what Senator Sullivan just said, you know, the Ayatollah has been publicly calling on the Biden administration to make commitments that any agreement, any terrible agreement they sign, must be permanent, must last to successor administrations. And the Biden administration has expressed a willingness to make that promise. There's just one small wrinkle. It doesn't have the constitutional authority to do so. There are two ways, and only two ways under our Constitution, that our government makes a binding promise. The first is a treaty signed by the President and ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. The second is through legislation passed by both houses of Congress and signed into law by the President. The Biden administration doesn't purport to do either one with this, which means there is a reason that President Trump was able to tear up this disastrous deal, because Obama, like Biden, tried to do it outside the constitutional structure. And if Biden does the same, he can rest assured it will have the same fate. The next Republican president, whoever that may be, will end any terrible deal that this administration enters.